Good morning. Uh, this is Bishop Kevin Doran here, and I'm invited to present to you this short PowerPoint presentation on the ministry of Catechist in the Catholic Church in Ireland. The presentation was originally given at a conference that took place in St. Kieran's College, Kilkenny in November of 2023. I would like to have been able to give this presentation in person, but unfortunately, I had a conflicting commitment on the date of the conference, which is taking place in February 2025. So I wanted to just introduce this uh, ministry of catechist, which has been presented to us in a motu proprio of Pope Francis called Ministerium Antiquum, an ancient ministry. And the name of that motu proprio itself obviously um, explains that the ministry of catechist uh, is nothing new in the life of the church. But the institution of members of the lay faithful, both men and women, in the ministry of the catechist is new to us. Um, this is somewhat different from people doing catechetical ministry, which is going on in various different ways in the church all the time. But Pope Francis decided in 2021 to formally institute uh, stable lay ministries for men and women uh, in catechesis, as well as in the ministry of acolyte and the ministry of lector. Um, and he situates the ministries, and particularly the ministry of catechist, in the context of the diversity of gifts found in the church since the beginning. So if you go back to the Acts of the Apostles, or indeed to the letters of St. Paul, we find that there was a myriad of different ministries and men and women in all the different places where, for instance, St. Paul and the other apostles went, who became involved and engaged in building up the body of Christ, the church. And we read in the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, for instance, there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different forms of service, but the same Lord. There are different workings, but the same God who produces all of them in everyone. So, against that background, I suppose we have to recognize that in many of our parishes and dioceses, we are uh, coming out of, or perhaps even still living with, uh, a view of church which sees one person as having all the gifts that are required for the life of the faith community. And if we have that perception of the parish priest, not only is it a huge burden on the parish priest, but it excludes the gifts of the lay faithful um, who have been baptized and called to mission through their baptism. So the institution of the ministry of the catechist is just one way among many in which Pope Francis is inviting us to look at a church in which all the baptized are missionary disciples. Pope Francis says to us in Ministerium Antiquum that this ministry has a definite vocational aspect, as evidenced by the right of institution, and consequently calls for due discernment on the part of the bishop. It's in fact a stable form of service rendered to the local church in accordance with pastoral needs identified by the local ordinary, yet one carried out as a work of the laity, as demanded by the very nature of the ministry. I think there are probably a number of things that are important here. First of all, the bishop has to discern the need for the ministry of catechist in his diocese, but it's also about uh, the individuals who might be called to that ministry discerning whether, in fact, uh, this is consistent with the gift they have received from the Holy Spirit. This is also described as a stable form of service. This is not simply about looking around for someone who might help me out with a particular project on a particular day or over a number of weeks, but rather a kind of ministry for which people are carefully formed, and in which people are instituted uh, for life. So Pope Francis has asked Episcopal conferences to render effective the ministry of catechist, determining the necessary process of formation and the normative criteria for admission to this ministry, and devising the most appropriate forms of the service, which these men and women will be called to exercise in conformity with the content of this apostolic letter. So, to each Episcopal conference, it falls to consider the circumstances of their own country, their own culture, and the particular needs of the church, and to prepare for the introduction of the ministry of catechist by looking at how people would be formed for that ministry, how people would be helped to discern their suitability for it, and also how that ministry might take shape, the particular kind of ministry that it might be in the context of each particular country. And in this case, of course, we're talking about Ireland. So in June 2023, the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference decided to establish the lay ministry of catechists. So that's a formal decision of the Bishops' Conference. And the bishops see this as a further step towards embracing the challenge of the new evangelization. So again, it's about responding to the call of the popes, really ever since the Second Vatican Council, to get on board with a new promotion of the gospel and an introduction of the vocation of every Christian to be a disciple. The document which we have prepared, Fan into a Flame, comes from the words of we find in the letter to Timothy, where Timothy is encouraged to fan into a flame the gift which he received when hands were laid on him. In other words, when he was ordained. But this ministry is not an ordained ministry; it's a lay ministry. But equally, we are being invited as bishops to fan into a flame this gift that we have in people of faith in all our parishes, in every diocese. And so this document outlines our vision for the development of this ministry, a vision which is the fruit of extensive consultation over a 2-year period between 2021 and 2023. And we see it as an essential pre-requirement of this ministry that we would establish the criteria for the selection of candidates and how they would be formed and how they would be instituted and the kind of ministry that they would exercise. And in order to help with doing that, the bishops decided to establish a coordinating body. And the idea of that would be that there would be a small a body of experts who would be responsible to the bishops to establish a coherent framework for the ministry of catechists so that it would serve the particular needs and circumstances of the various dioceses. So looking at the ministry of catechist, the first thing we need to recognize is that, like every ministry in the church, it is a sharing in the mission of Jesus Christ. And Jesus, in different ways in the Gospels, explains to the disciples how he wants them to continue the work that he began. We see this in the Last Supper narrative in St. John's Gospel, but we also see it in that passage at the end of St. Matthew's Gospel where Jesus says, "Go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." And that really is the mission of the church. So the ministry of catechesis is not just about explaining to people about the faith as if it was some kind of thing that you would learn about. It's about introducing people to the person of Jesus and helping people to work out how they may be called through baptism to be disciples. The challenge for us, I suppose, is that over the past 50 years in Ireland, things have changed in many ways. Change is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes we find it difficult to adapt to change. We live in a much more diverse Ireland where Christian faith is no longer the dominant culture. In that respect, we're not that different from the rest of Europe. Um, but it is becoming increasingly clear to us, I think, that um, catechesis depends on evangelization. And this is not the way that we have really been working over the last 50 years. In the past, perhaps we could depend on young people, for instance, being introduced to Jesus in a personal way by their parents and having an active engagement in the life of their parish, uh, and then being catechized at school. Nowadays, the situation is quite different. Not all children are being introduced, uh, even by Catholic parents, to their faith. Um, Not all children, certainly by any means, are actively engaged in the life of their parish, even after First Holy Communion and confirmation. And increasingly, the pressure is on schools to distinguish between religious education and catechesis. And religious education, I suppose, is education about religion, whereas catechesis is about uh, helping people uh, to be disciples. So, if the Irish Church is no longer forming disciples in the way it did in the past, I think we can say it's because, for various historical and cultural reasons, we are still trying to do catechesis, but without doing evangelization. And this would suggest to me that the ministry of catechesis in Ireland will need to have a strong evangelical focus. In other words, it's going to have to be about meeting Jesus in the Gospels and walking with him, and then coming to understand how he wants us to live our baptismal vocation as disciples. The Directory for Catechesis, published in 2020 by the Pontifical Council for the New Evangelization, Jesus Christ is described as the model catechist. And what do we mean by that? Well, we see Jesus in his ministry gathering people, speaking to them in a language that they understand, and opening up to them the mystery of God's love. As catechists ourselves, we don't take the place of Jesus, but rather by gathering people and speaking to them in a language that they understand, we seek to connect people with Jesus. And again, as we read, the definitive aim of catechesis is to put people not only in touch, but in communion, in intimacy with Jesus Christ. The Directory for Catechesis uses 6 particular concepts to describe uh, the ministry of catechist, or to describe the catechist as an individual minister. Catechist is a witness of faith and a keeper of the memory of God, sharing the joy of his or her own encounter with Christ, while also keeping the memory of God alive in the community. So there's that personal witness to one's own experience, and then the sharing of that in the community. The catechist is also a teacher and a mystagogue. I suppose we tend to know, or we think we feel we know, what a teacher is. The catechist communicates the content of faith in the way that a teacher would, but also leads others into the mystery of faith. And mystagogy is a lifelong process which is associated with helping people to live the sacraments. So, for instance, mystagogy is very much associated with the process that continues after the baptism or Christian initiation of adults. Our baptism and Christian initiation obviously happen at an earlier age, but the idea is that the catechist, as mystagogue, helps people to deepen their sense of what it means to live the sacraments. The catechist is also an accompanier and an educator. So the catechist walks with people, a little bit in the same way that Jesus walked with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and much as Jesus did, draws out the truth that they already have without recognizing it. And that's, I suppose, the heart of the meaning of the word educator, the one who draws out the truth. In our discussions about the ministry of catechists in Ireland, uh, over the last couple of years, we came up with a number of important questions for discussion. And these include the ones you see here on the screen. Who could be a catechist? Will only a few be catechists? Will catechists be employees or volunteers? Will the focus be on ministry to children or to adults? What will the formation program look like? How should we understand the scope of the ministry of catechist? And what will be the relationship between the ministry of catechist and other ministries, lay and ordained in the church? So these questions are the ones that I want to focus on for the remainder of this presentation. So to address the first question, I suppose, who could be a catechist? The simple answer is that when we look at Ministerium Antiquum, the ministry of catechist is open to a lay woman or a layman who has been fully initiated into the church by baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. Clearly not every lay man or woman who has been baptized, confirmed, is necessarily called to the ministry of catechist, and people have different gifts. So what we need is people who have particular gifts and qualities, among which the most important would be, first of all, a commitment to his or her own personal faith formation and to being a disciple. Because if we're not committed to being disciples ourselves, it's very hard to encourage others to be disciples. A desire to share the gift of faith by bringing Christ to others. So this is about having hearts, I suppose, that are on fire with love for Christ and a desire to share that love with others. An ability to follow the academic program. Now, we've said that this would normally be reflected by having leaving certificate level education. The leaving cert itself is not the issue. The issue is the ability to follow the academic program. And so each person, I suppose, will have to be considered on their own basis. A capacity to form relationships based on trust and mutual respect, and to work effectively with others. And again, this means that a catechist, a little bit like Jesus on the road to Emmaus, has to be able to walk with people, has to be able to listen to people as they speak about their disappointments and their hopes, and then to be able to respond to that and to work effectively with them. A well-developed capacity to use the gift of reason, and this is because while faith is, I suppose, a relationship of the heart, the understanding of what Jesus teaches and of what the church teaches and of how we might live that in the world in which we are at the moment requires the use of reason. And then the capacity with appropriate formation to communicate effectively. Someone with a deep faith and even a very deep understanding of faith may not necessarily be gifted with the capacity for communication, and that would certainly limit their possibility to be an effective catechist. The question was raised and discussed at length by the various groups who were consulted over the last couple of years about whether there would only be a few catechists or whether there would be many. And I suppose a distinction has to be made between those who exercise catechetical ministry generally, uh, and in some cases that might be for an hour or two here and there, uh, or in a particular local situation, but those who are instituted formally in the ministry of catechist. So it shouldn't be assumed that people would be instituted in the ministry of catechist simply on the basis that they teach religious education or that they help with a catechetical initiative in the parish. Um, those who are instituted in the ministry of catechist have this um, ongoing and permanent mission in the church, uh, and it's somewhat different. They will be called by the bishop. They will be formed specifically for this ministry, and they will be instituted for life. That doesn't mean that they have to continue actively being uh, engaged in mission until they uh, die. But it's akin to uh, ordination or marriage in the sense that it's a lifelong uh, mission. And even when people are no longer exercising that ministry in a full time capacity uh, due to, say, illness or retirement or whatever, um, they have still been instituted for life. Another question that has risen was whether catechists would be employees or volunteers. And I think the important question there, this will vary a little bit from perhaps diocese to diocese, depending on what the local needs are and also depending on what kind of resourcing is available. The important thing is that every man or woman who's instituted in the ministry of catechist exercise the same ecclesial ministry. So there are not two different degrees of institution depending on whether people are employed or volunteers. Catechists will all be entrusted with mission by the bishop in a formal way, but they won't all necessarily have the same canonical mission, nor will they all exercise their ministry under the same conditions. So some dioceses will employ people who have been instituted as catechists, and in that case, they are employees and ecclesial ministers. And it's important to recognise that as employees, then they have to be treated in the same way as other employees. Some dioceses may find it helpful or practicable to have a large number of volunteer catechists. Um, and these may also be instituted as catechists, but as volunteers, they would be entrusted in a formal way with ministry, but they are not employees. And some dioceses may choose to have a mixture. In either case, the terms and conditions, and this is the important thing, I think, that in any diocese, the terms and conditions must be clearly agreed and documented, whether that be in a volunteer agreement or in a contract of employment, so that there is clarity and respect. One of the questions that has arisen in the discussions that we have been having over the last few years is whether the ministry of catechist would be focused on children or on adults. And we believe that the introduction of the instituted ministry of catechists provides an opportunity to develop faith formation in parishes, which is intergenerational in its nature, providing for the needs of adults of all ages, of young people, and of children. So the intergenerational thing is the important thing, is that as parishes are called to form disciples, uh, it's important that that's happening at every age level. And there will be some projects where it can happen across the generations. But it's interesting that the Directory for Catechesis, including uh, also Share the Good News and the older document Catechesi Tradendae, all emphasize that the catechesis of adults is the chief form and model for all catechesis and for faith development at every level in the church. And this is something I think that we need to grasp. Um, our children are fairly well provided for in school, but in many cases, what they need most of all is adults to model faith for them. And if we're not forming our adults in faith once they leave school at the age of 17, uh, then how do we expect them to grow in faith? And how do we expect them also then to be able to share faith with their children? So the catechesis of adults is the chief form and model for all catechesis. The parish needs to be central rather than peripheral. At the moment, there's an assumption that most catechesis happens in schools. And that's, again, an, I suppose it's an unfair expectation on schools, especially if catechesis is not happening in the home and if it's not happening in the parish. Uh, so the task of engaging parents more fully in their own faith journey is certainly crucial for the formation of children and the strengthening of parish life. So it's like a three-legged stool. Um, the parents are the first educators of their children in the faith, and that's what we say in the celebration of baptism. The parish supports them in that, and the school supports them in that. All three are important, but the focus of the ministry of catechist is not to replace teachers in the schools, but rather to do something new, something which we're perhaps not doing at the moment. The idea of the formation program for the Ministry of Catechist is that there would be a period of accompanied discernment before admission as a candidate. This could be a period of 6 months to a year. Uh, and that would be sort of a vocational discernment journey where a catechist or a person who is considering being a catechist would be accompanied and would have a spiritual director and so on. The formation program itself then would focus not just on academic knowledge, but on developing key skills and characteristics. Formation would be integral in nature, including knowing how to be with people, sort of developing relational skills, knowing the content of faith, so involving at least 2 years of study at higher certificate or diploma level. It would involve pedagogical and methodological elements. In other words, people will need to learn how to communicate the faith. And alongside that, communication skills, because in our contemporary environment, people no longer tolerate easily sitting down just listening to someone talking. So the use of IT and social media for the communication of faith is an important part of the formation of catechists. And then through supervised placements, through, I suppose, trying it out, through learning to fly, the candidate who is hoping to be instituted as a catechist will hopefully become a spirit-filled evangelizer. And so these pastoral placements are an essential part of that. And if the trainee catechists, for want of a better word, are to become effective, they have to try out their skills, and it has to be established whether they actually have those skills. The scope of the ministry is an important question that we discussed in some detail. Traditionally, catechetical ministry would be associated with communicating knowledge and understanding of the faith. And this is understood to be a clear need in the parish context. So the deepening of the understanding of faith, because in many cases our understanding of faith uh, ceases to grow as soon as we leave school. Um, and indeed, many of our second level schools now, which don't operate out of the Catholic ethos, don't provide religious education. Um, But depending on the needs of the diocese and on their own particular gifts, catechists can also minister in a variety of settings. Uh, and Fan into a Flame describes that in paragraph 45. Uh, so the element of witness, which we mentioned before, could extend to include social action, justice and ecology, and building up the community of faith. The element of accompaniment would draw catechists into ministry with specific groups of young people, with the elderly, with disabled people, or people with disability, and with migrants. And then the element of mystagogy might involve catechists in areas such as prayer leadership, liturgical formation, and the Christian initiation of adults. Co-responsibility is one of the terms that has occurred quite a lot in our conversations around the uh, recent synod of bishops, the Universal Synod, and responsibility has to be part of the process of the ministry of catechist. There must be a concerted commitment to move away from a kind of ministry where people work in silos. So where you have priests on one place and deacons in another place and parish secretaries in another place and none of them talking to one another. For catechists, it's a two-way challenge because first of all, catechists need to work in communion with the bishop and to develop the capacity to work effectively with one another and with other people who exercise ministry in the church, whether lay or ordained. So the catechists themselves will have to develop that capacity for co-responsibility. But equally, they need to be deployed or assigned in partnership with priests, religious, and other ministers who will recognise and affirm their gifts and their ministry. And if priests and religious are not willing to work with catechists, then there's no point in assigning catechists to their parishes. Um, so we need to discern carefully where catechists will be assigned, especially in the early stages of the ministry. Finally, we need to look at ongoing formation for catechists in the same way as we do with other ministries. We probably don't pay as much attention to it as we should, and we priests perhaps are as much at fault as any. But formation is a long is a lifelong process, and catechists are not formed for once and for all. They have to be provided with regular structured opportunities to deepen and renew their academic knowledge and their skills as well as their faith. Participation in these ongoing formation programs would not be seen as an optional extra, but an essential part of maintaining fitness for ministry. And the document Fan into a Flame recognises that some catechists will have the ability, energy, or desire for further study, and that should be encouraged and supported in the pursuit of higher qualifications and specializations. So these are just a few things to introduce people to the ministry of catechist in Fan into a Flame. My own personal experience would suggest that the formation of catechists in some ways is the easier part. The question of how to deploy catechists and to develop their ministry is in some ways maybe the more challenging part and the bit that we need to pay particular attention to. We can't just institute people in ministry and then send them out without clarity about their mission and without supports to enable them to become the catechists they're called to be.